Right. So I'm Sarah from Hartlepool, and just to give you a bit of context really about Hartlepool Borough Council, it's a very, very small council, a unitary authority on the northeast coast, really small population, 90,000 people. And I would say 11 out of our 13 wards are in the topmost 5% deprived in the country, so there's a lot of deprivation in the area. I'm really conscious after listening to stuff today that there's quite a lot of differences between how care and support is provided in England and how it is in Ireland. So I've tried to put a little bit of context in around the history of care and support. Certainly this isn't just probably a local picture to Hartlepool, it's probably quite a national picture to England. And around 1998, I was actually working as a student nurse in an institution at that time. And the onset of the National Health Service and Community Care Act started to play out, and we started to see people who'd been in long-stay institutions for a long, long time moving out, I would say, very rapidly out of institutions. And basically, across the country, they were generally moving into smaller residential type units. Really, I would say there was still quite an institutional approach to the care and support that people were getting. But the units that they were moving to were much, much smaller. And I think around about 2000, the year 2000, and I've done this really just off my own experiences, the local authority in Hartlepool, and I think this isn't sort of that common across the country in England, but we outsourced pretty much all of our residential accommodation to the private sector. So when we did that, again, a lot of that work was done. It was probably deemed to be right at the time, but probably quite reactively. So looking at who moved in with who and the group living sort of dynamics probably wasn't looked at as well as it should have been. But what we really had was sort of two models of accommodation. One was supported living accommodation, where people were sort of in group homes with tenancies and in receipt of their sort of welfare benefits, and the other was small registered residential homes. At the time, the regulatory body would have been registration and inspection. So that was the model that we were sort of running with. Then to bring us back up a little bit today, around about 2005, I worked in Hartlepool then as a field social worker. And I would say we were a good authority. We had a good reputation as a local authority. We were a 4-star council and a 3-star social services department, which was sort of, it's banded, the criteria would mean it was excellent. But I would argue at the time when I worked there, I worked in field social work teams in older people's services, learning disability, people with long-term condition and sensory impairment, and I would argue that people weren't getting really very sensible, ordinary responses to the support needs. So you might have wanted to do something and facilitate something for a family that was quite a simple response, but because of the bureaucratic systems and the contracts that we had in place, it wasn't possible to do it. So we were classed as having good services with very limited choice. So, for example, older people, if they wanted care in the community and support at home, we commissioned and contracted with 3 agencies across the borough. So if you lived in the north, you had to have one agency. If you lived in the south, you had another. And if you were central, you had another. So there wasn't any choice there. And there was no competition. So we tended to have people who would just say to me, I have to go to bed at 8 o'clock and I don't want to go to bed at 8 o'clock. Or I have to get up at 6 o'clock or 10 o'clock because the agency's busy time is in between that. And as a social worker, I found that really frustrating because I'd ring the agency and say, you need to be more flexible with Mrs. Cannybody, and they'd say, we can't. And I would try and find another option, and I couldn't. So it was sort of like, you could do brilliant planning with people, but you had a pick list of services that were very limited. So it was quite a frustrating situation. At the time, each local authority in England had they had a duty to offer direct payments by that time. In the Community Care Act Community Care and Direct Payments Act 96 gave local authorities a power to offer people direct payments, but not a duty. So it was very slow on the uptake in England, direct payments. And in 2003, the guidance around direct payments was updated, and then it became a duty. And I would say in 2005, I moved from a social work team into a local authority direct payment support team to try and get direct payments off the ground. And we had only about 30 people on direct payments, and they were really using direct payments to buy traditional packages of support. A couple of people were employing people, but really, really poor uptake. People didn't know the rights. They didn't know that they had a right to a direct payment if they had an eligible social care need, and staff clearly didn't know that they had a duty to offer people a direct payment in the first instance. So at that time, we got a new director. And she was pretty horrified really when she came in around our lack of innovation and how traditional our services were. And so with her came a new direction of travel, which was, you know, only positive from my point of view. She had come from a small coastal local authority in our region, Redcar, and they had been involved in an in-control pilot that started in around 2003. And it wasn't just In Control who ran that pilot. I think it was people from Valuing People, local authorities across the country, peer support groups, user-led organisations came together and started thinking, why is it that people aren't getting what they need? So they started to look at, if we do some work with people around giving them money or you know, giving them more control over the services that they're entitled to, will they get better outcomes than the local authority get for them? And it grew really, really rapidly in England. I think initially the work began in 6 pilot sites, and all of the work was focused around people with learning disabilities being able to direct their own support. And the stuff that came out of the pilots really early on suggested that the system of self-directed support was for everybody, not just people with a label of learning disabilities. So I think within probably about a year of signing up to In Control, which was really, it was a subscription we made as a local authority, which bought us really the support from that organisation to transform our services. We were going to run with a pilot, and within about 3 months our director decided we weren't having a pilot at all. We were going to roll this out to everybody with an eligible social care need within a year, which sounds like a long time, but believe you me, being responsible to put those systems in place, that was a really short period of time to totally transform all of our services and systems. Other sort of national policy directives were supporting personal budgets and individualised budgets and direct payments as a way of improving sort of citizenship. And from the pilots, we could anecdotally say people are getting much better satisfaction and quality support with the same or less money than we were spending on them. So it was sort of like, it's the only way to go and it's the right thing to do. By December 2007, we went live with our sort of total transformation programme. So what that meant in practice was everybody who came to the local authority who had an eligible need would be offered a personal budget, and we could pretty much tell them how much we thought we would be able to spend on them and what the resource would be within sort of like a 24-hour period of going out to see them. And as you can imagine, there was lots of people who were sort of in the system, for want of a better way of describing it, who would maybe be subject to annual reviews. And it was sort of like, how do we get to those people and let them have the choice of transferring over to a better system for them? And the way that we had to manage that was when the person was due an annual social care review, we would then say, this is the budget that you're entitled to. Do you want to have a direct payment? You know, how do you want to use that budget? And start to look at planning with people what they wanted to do. When we set off, I would say we had a pretty robust resource allocation system, which was quite rare in England, because everybody, just about, I'm generalising, but probably 90% of the local authorities that we worked with got completely stuck on that first hurdle, and then people weren't getting access to the information of what budgets they were entitled to, because everybody got completely obsessed by the money. Everybody got completely obsessed by, can we afford it? This isn't perfect, that's not perfect. And frankly, the system we were allocating resources in prior to running personal budgets was far, far from perfect. And as part of the exercises we did to look at what we should be giving people financially, we looked at 2 people, for example, with very similar needs, very similar support networks and social capital and informal support, and one would maybe have an allocation of £2,000 in the traditional system, and the other would maybe have an allocation of 120 grand. So there was clearly massive inequities in the system in the way that we were allocating resources. So we had the robust resource allocation system, and we were meeting the needs of new people accessing services. So when people were coming through and they were having an assessment, the allocation that we were telling them they had, there was support planning, and it was managing their needs really well. The problem that we started having as we rolled it out was there was a massive disparity between what people who were already receiving sort of previously commissioned services. Some people, for example, who'd been in the same residential home for maybe a lot of years, when we were putting them through the RAS and supporting them in the self-assessment, they were coming out with very different allocations to what the current service cost. And we had to start to look at why that was. And the majority of the time, you know, after we did a lot of work, it was because we'd commissioned the services that they had traditionally poorly. We might have commissioned them in a crisis situation. It might have been as a result of the work that I've spoke about earlier in you know, placing people in provision that really there wasn't much planning went into around, is that the right environment for the person? Are we decreasing their independence levels and making them more dependent? So we had to start looking at how do we manage that issue. And one of the typical scenarios was, I mean, that's just an example, and £600 probably a completely off-the-wall figure. But we would have 6 people who lived in a group home with massively different needs, and we were paying the provider the same amount of money for each person on a block contract. And when I went in and started unpicking some of those projects, we weren't actually even just paying that provider that amount of money. There was multiple monies and funding streams that weren't transparent initially coming in from all over. So people might have been in 24-hour supported living or residential, but then they were using the building-based day service 5 days a week. They were getting health support and monies on top of the support they were getting. And it wasn't really a viable option for people, because we had people who were living together, some who maybe needed 2-to-1 support in relation to staffing, and someone else who was going to shop on their own and accessing the community independently, and they were receiving the same level of support. So the person who had quite low-level support needs and quite independent, if they moved on and out, then, and somebody moved into that provision with very high-level needs, it made it not viable. There wasn't enough staff, there wasn't enough resources going in. So what we had to do was start to looking at all the individual funding streams everybody was eligible for, and what was the conditionality around those funding streams. Now, I know I've been saying, do they have independent living fund in Ireland? You know, I feel quite, it's all quite new to me. Do they have supporting people in Ireland? And, you know, and I've learnt that there isn't a lot of those extra funding streams at the moment. And I suppose my colleagues alluded earlier to how difficult it is to actually get that money in England. So you might be subject, lots of people I work with are subject to 6 assessments to find out what they're eligible for. And this was the process we had to go through. We had to look at what's the person eligible for, how do we get hold of the money, and what we did was we ring-fenced that money to each individual person. So we maximised all the funding that they were able to access. We looked at what were their aspirations around their accommodation needs. Where did they want to live? Who did they want to live with? There was some obviously really strong relationships, and some people said, I want to share my support with Peter on a Monday night because we both like going to that activity, but I don't want to have to go out if everybody else is going out when I want to stay in. But because there isn't enough staff, we all have to go out or we all have to stay in. So we started looking at where people needed personal individual support and where they were happy and it was right to share support, who was going to provide that support. And this particular project that I worked on, everybody wanted to stay with that same provider. Other ones that I've gone in and worked in since, maybe out of 6 people, 2 have maybe moved on into their own single tenancy or into different sort of accommodation models. But all these people wanted to stay together, but some wanted to have a direct payment for part of the support to pay another provider. So there was sort of some complications there. But we managed them and we worked them out. And we did person-centred support planning with each person, so we were really clear along the way about what is right for this person and what are their aspirations and what are their goals. And we put the money against it, which was really, really powerful. And obviously we focused on the outcomes, not just the local authority and PCT and other funding streams outcomes, but what outcomes did the individuals and their families want to achieve through their support. The stakeholders, as I was listening to everybody else's stuff, I thought I forgot one there. I haven't put on there, like we've got user-led brokerage services, and they're often really useful to help people looking at sort of what they want to do going forward, because they're much more impartial than the social worker might be or the provider might be. But we pretty much worked with everybody around trying to work these packages of support out. And I must say, the key to it working is having a good trusted provider, because what we ended up with was an outcome-focused contract for each person with the provider. And as you can see, the My Budget bit's just one of the areas which people alluded to earlier. It's not just about the money. You've got to take into account when you're putting a support plan together with somebody, what are their gifts and skills? You know, we don't want to be in the business of creating dependency and, you know, looking at citizenship. What social contacts have they got? What family and friends? Some within the work, a couple of people resumed relationships with people that had from previous living experiences and family members who they'd lost contact with, which is obviously really powerful. But actually, that's a really basic thing that we should be supporting people to maintain as they go. We looked at the person's needs, desired outcomes, and we then ring-fenced an amount of money that was feasible for each individual person. And we individualised the supporting people funding, which is what Jude was talking about earlier. And one of the ladies in that provision has got to move on now. She's showing signs that she really can't live with other people. She's really unhappy when anybody's coming in, and she's fine when she's on her own. And we've managed to find her a lovely little bungalow, and she can move with her package because all of that money will go with her. And those packages we set up, I would say it's probably 2.5 years ago, and they haven't shifted at all. So we ring-fenced that money, gave it to the provider, and said, we pretty much don't want to know on a day-to-day basis if that changes slightly. We don't want you to ring up and say, oh, you know, Billy's not going to the day centre today, so you need to give us some more money to cover that extra staffing. And it worked the other way on as well. So we didn't expect to get money back if somebody decided not to go somewhere, or, you know, they went on holiday overnight with a parent, because the amount of transactions we were doing in the old system between commissioner and provider and all of the conversations about 50 pence were just creating huge, massive issues in the system. So, but the only way you can do this piece of work is if the provider is a trusted provider, and that relationship's there, that you can actually say, that's the money that we're ring-fencing for this person, and we expect you to meet these outcomes over the year with them. And we expect you to come back to us and tell us if there's any major changes in that plan. And it's worked really, really well for all of the people that live there. There's been a reduction in the use of day services, and I wouldn't say people have stopped, because some days they were going to building-based day services they enjoyed, and other days they clearly didn't. So now they've got a choice, because the package doesn't depend on them being out of the house from 9 till 5, which was what was happening. People got to day services because it was a cost-saving exercise, which is just appalling. The packages provide flexibility, so people have got much more flexibility in their day-to-day lives. They can move the money about much freer. One person moving on doesn't destabilise the whole model of accommodation, and it does avoid crisis. The providers don't have to think, oh, where's the social worker? It's Friday night and something's changed and we need more support in the package and we need the local authority's authorisation and all the rest of it. And it has massively reduced transactions between the provider and the local authority. And I would say I know these people really well. I still work with them all, and it has created much better lives for them. Much more predictable and much more personalised packages of support. And that's Tom, and Tom recently went on one of our family leadership courses, because I would say as well, just doing it from the system side isn't enough. You do really need to start really getting people involved in the sort of policy development and the movement forward. But the only way you can do that is to prepare them for that. To just bring somebody into a meeting that, you know, is just really, you know, meetings go in certain areas and it's not necessarily a positive experience for anybody. And if somebody sat there and they're thinking, I don't really understand the structure of the organisation and what I'm here for and how I can influence the decisions going forward, it's just tokenistic. So Tom did our, it's a family leadership course called Making It Happen. It's run by Partners in Policy Makers in England. And I would say there's about 25 people on that course, and they're all very, very much involved in anything that we do in the local authority now, tender processes, anything that we're moving forward. There's somebody from that group on it. And we're starting our planning and family leadership for young children in transition, young people in transition next week. That's a 5-day event, so hopefully that'll be really successful as well. So that's our story. Thank you.